Hi, I'm Amy Porter, and this is my podcast. My mission is to show people how to empower themselves through music, business, and media. I try to see as clearly as possible how I can help. I showcase the music that I've played and the people I've met along the way. I'm a wife and a stepmom. You might know me as a professor, a performer, a producer, a publisher, a recording artist. I'm the founder of a couple of nonprofits. Welcome in to my Porter Flute pod. Welcome to Porter Flute Pod. It's Business 101, and we're getting down to business with Michael Haithcock. He's the director of bands here at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and one of the most professional people we all know. So let's talk to him about commissioning composers, and the future of music. In the pod with me asking the questions, and I'm also asking the questions, is Alan J. Tomasetti and Justine Sedke. We went to the vault and got out my personal recording of Joel Puckett's Shadow of Sirius, written for me and the University of Michigan Symphony Band, because it's the 10th anniversary. Why not? Let's celebrate it. It's actually 10 plus 1. 11 years ago, this was premiered here in Ann Arbor. I'm so lucky. I'm just so happy to celebrate it again. October 22nd, Hill Auditorium. Michael Haithcock conducting the University of Michigan Symphony Band. So let's hear more about it. Welcome to Porter Flute Pod. We're so happy you're here. Michael Haithcock is the director of university bands and Arthur F. Thurnow Professor and the Professor of Music and Conducting. He assumed his duties as director of bands and professor of music at the University of Michigan in the fall of 2001, following 23 years on the faculty of Baylor University. Following in the footsteps of William D. Ravelli and H. Robert Reynolds, Professor Haithcock conducts the internationally renowned University of Michigan Symphony Band. He guides the acclaimed graduate band and wind ensemble conducting program, and he provides administrative leadership for all aspects of the University of Michigan's diverse and historic band program. Ensembles under Michael Haithcock's guidance have received a wide array of critical acclaim for their high artistic standards of performance and repertoire. These accolades have come through concerts at national and state conventions, performances in major concert venues, and recordings on the Albany, Arsis, and Equilibrium labels. Haithcock has earned the praise of both composers and conductors for his innovative approaches to developing the wind ensemble repertoire and programming, and I think you're going to hear that today. Haithcock is in constant demand as a guest conductor, and he's a resource person for symposiums and workshops in a variety of instructional settings. A graduate of East Carolina University, where he received the 1996 Outstanding Alumni Award from the School of Music, and Baylor University, Haithcock has done additional study at a variety of conducting workshops, including the Herbert Blomstedt Orchestral Conducting Institute. The Instrumentalist, you know that magazine, MSBOA, Michigan School Band and Orchestra Association, The School Musician, the Southwest Music Educator, and Winds Magazine have published his articles on conducting and wind literature. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome Michael Haithcock. Welcome, my friend Michael Haithcock, to Porter Flute Pod.
Thank you, Amy. It's nice to be with you.
We have some questions for you because you're so impressive with bringing us the future of music. So that's what this podcast is about. It's kind of what it's called, the future of music and commissioning. We have had our live music put on hold, so you kept commissioning, I'm pretty sure, through this whole process, or thinking about the commissioning of future works post-COVID. And so we wanted to know about your thoughts on commissioning in general, because the University of Michigan Symphony Band, and you in particular, are so generous in the music that you bring to us. Could you tell us your experience in commissioning composers and works for band?
Sure. Let me start by retracing my upbringing to being a saxophone major in college. And the saxophone major does not have the canonic repertoire that many instruments have. And I had the joy and the privilege of studying with a man named James Hulick, who was not only a classical saxophonist, but he was a classical tenor saxophonist. So you can imagine that his repertoire was a constant evolution as he learned to connect with composers and go after big fish, little fish, anybody who would write a piece. And it just kind of hit me as a way of being. And at that time, my goal was to replace my high school band director when he retired, a goal that I failed at miserably. But, I got connected with this idea of if you don't have a canonic repertoire, then you have to go out and build it. And then as things moved forward and I was able to have some of the fortunate positions I've been able to have, that sort of ethos stuck with me. And then it became not just building a repertoire because you don't have one, but what's the kind of repertoire that you have? What's the diversity of style? What's the diversity of representation? All the things that are so crucial in today's world. I mean, I was already involved in that long before this moment in time, but the moment in time has just made the need for us to do it all the more important.
How different is commissioning a band and getting it replayed and replayed and replayed to call it canonic or part of the canon, and the difference between the orchestra and getting it repeated and repeated and having it part of the canon?
Well, I mean, if you go back to when so much of the classical orchestral repertoire that's canonic, the Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, etc., the wind ensemble didn't have all the instruments that it has now. Saxophones had not yet been invented. The tuba was represented by the serpent. Beethoven 5 was the first piece to have a piccolo. So, it's hard to have a fully developed instrumentation if you don't have the instruments. So the classical octet of two oboes, two clarinets, two bassoons, two horns, supplemented later by flutes. Mozart added some extra instruments with basset horns from time to time and the two other horns. So you can sort of see the development of the orchestral wind section in the way that the music for wind instruments that was often viewed as entertainment music, or, the iPod of the day, the aristocrats would hire their octet to play transcriptions of the operas and ballets that they liked. You can kind of see that develop along. But it was really the French Revolution that catapulted the development of instruments and allowed what we now know as the modern wind band to develop. That took almost 100 years. Our friend and colleague, William Bolcom, says that, the orchestra has gotten itself stuck because they stopped adding instruments. They didn't add saxophones. They didn't add, this or that. And everything has become about the dollar and how many things we're paying for. Well, in the academy, where most of the highest level of wind bands exist, we don't have the restrictions of having to sell tickets, so we can really be more of an artistic. And there are people who say to me, there are composers who say to me, well, the bands of today are doing what the orchestras should have been doing all along. I think orchestras are catching up some, particularly in the areas of diversity and inclusion with composers. Some have been forced upon them by social changes in the past few years. But, in terms of repertoire and repetition, if I build a consortium of 10 or 15 ensembles to commission a piece, it's going to have that many performances. If fill in the blank orchestra commissions a piece, it may or may not have more than one performance. And so I think younger composers and even composers who are my age and my friends and colleagues here on campus have realized over the last 20 plus years that there's a lot of friends out there in the band world and that their music can be very well received and receive multiple performances. Doesn't lessen the impact of getting a commission from one of the elite ensembles on the planet that is a major orchestra. But there's more measures to success for composers these days, just like there are for players. There's more ways to enjoy your art, more ways to express yourself than just one small track.
I agree. And we have had some composers at Michigan, pardon the phrase, reverse engineer their orchestral work to be for band and found quite a life in that piece.
Well, I think the dual version phenomenon that you're referencing by a number of composers, not just composers at Michigan, is really a Baroque concept. I mean, Bach did the same thing. So, we went through this period in the Romantic era, for example, where some people call it the composer is God myth, where everything was single track. I mean, Mozart stole from Haydn. They stole from each other. They borrowed folk songs. There's so many things that, some people have viewed in the 20th century as being lowbrow, which were commonplace in the highest of brow that we consider a classical canon. So I think, if I was a composer and I wrote a piece for orchestra and I could see with integrity a way to make a dual version of it, I'd sure do it, because that's the way to make a living. And think about the number of pieces that you've played on recitals that weren't originally for flute. Think about the number of times those Schumann pieces are played by clarinet, by oboe, by soprano sax. I mean, good Lord, you go down the list. I find that if the composer feels it's worthy of doing what I call a dual version, as opposed to me taking an orchestral score and transcribing it, which I've never done, although there are transcriptions by non-composers that I do because I think they work really well and I love. But I don't have any hesitation if a composer feels that a dual version works for their piece to do it. And I think it gives, again, a greater sense of fulfillment for the composer because they're going to get to hear the piece more. And it also, frankly, they have to earn a living. And that's a big part of why a composer writes.
Let's talk about the fulfillment of the composer and where it starts in the commissioning process, because you could be in a class at school, meet someone, become friends with them, and then all of a sudden start to hear their name being spoken off the tongues of others. And you say, wait, that's my friend. Maybe I should commission them. So can we talk about the process of commissioning and the thoughts of commissioning your friend versus, some big name? Because I always say, hey, have your friend write you a piece, premiere it. It goes on your resume, and you never know where that person's going to end up.
Sure. Well, let me go back to my saxophone days at East Carolina University. The composer at a small college 35 miles away wrote material for my saxophone teacher and for our saxophone quartet. And he would come over and pass out the music. We would sight read it. He'd take it up, work on it, come back the next week, and it would be improved. So I think that friendship is not only a matter of resume building or promotion, but it also gives the composer a chance to workshop. I mean, if I think about each of our faculty colleagues that I've worked with at Michigan over the past 21 years, everyone has a different way of working, but they're all open to hearing the results of their work and making adjustments. Everyone wants to make the document the most accurate document they can make, because that's what gives life to the integrity of their artistic intention. So to commission a piece by the person sitting 2 rows over in your theory class or music history, whatever the class is, that's just continuing a cycle of friendship. I mean, if you listen to the Beethoven octet for that classical harmony, the second horn part is harder than the first, and it gets all the solos. Well, that's because the low horn player was one of Beethoven's best friends. So this is not a novel idea. You go back all the way through music history and you can see pieces dedicated to friends, not necessarily commissioned by friends, but dedicated to. And I one of the reasons I moved to Michigan so many years ago was the opportunity to live in this sort of greenhouse of composition we have. I mean, we have 8 or 9 faculty composers. We have, almost 70 composition students. And it's really a fertile ground for creative collaboration and for ideas. And so whether or not somebody's a student at Michigan or they're a student at, any school that has a composition program, latching on and identifying yourself as someone who's interested in new pieces. The commission fee may be, hey, I'll buy Chinese food.
Exactly. I always say a 6-pack of beer will get you everywhere.
It doesn't have to be at the student level of commissioning a heavy negotiation or a big fee. It can just be, hey, let's help each other by doing something interesting and creative. And I'm so pleased with how our students at Michigan have latched onto these ideas and are doing robust work. But again, it doesn't have to be just Michigan, and it just doesn't have to be for your solo instrument. We have a number of what one might consider to be odd instrumentated chamber groups that have been spawned at school over the last few years, because friends got together and said, hey, if we have this collective, we can commission works that are new for us as a group, but also we can use our collective forces in smaller groups and we can create an interesting program. And, I think there's so many new ideas for chamber groups beyond those that are canonic, the woodwind quintet, the string quartet. Those are well filled canons, but as well as deserving of new material. But there's a lot of variety out there that's possible.
I'd like to give a shout out to Professor Evan Chambers, who in a conversation with Professor Richard Aaron decided, let's find a few instruments for the first year and give our composition students chamber music to write. So the first year was flute and cello, and I think it was piano. And that was such a great assignment. And this assignment from Evan Chambers to his students to write for specific studios puts a very high bar, because Professor Aaron's studio, my studio, every single studio in the school can play. And so we're so excited to receive new pieces. I just came across a lot of scores for chamber music, and I'm going to see if I can get them replayed instead of just one assignment. Let's get these pieces out there.
Well, the other thing that happens historically, the canon wasn't the canon when it was written. So
that's what Justine said last week.
Yeah, I mean, Beethoven was, in some quarters, was not as popular as Hummel back in the day, and you can see how that turned out. So I think, time has a wonderful way of sifting, and repetition and exposure. Someone said to me long ago, there's two ways to think about this. Literature is what exists. repertoire is what gets played. So there's this repertoire, if you want to use it as an inclusive, that doesn't really see the light of day anymore. And it's just literature. It's like the books on your shelf that you've never read. But the repertoire is what's living and breathing and getting played. And I think what we're all trying to do in this context of commissioning and building an increasingly diverse set of repertoire is get as much literature produced, turn it into repertoire, and then let history and the quality of what's developed play out over time. If I look back, I mean, this is my 44th year of doing this work. And if I look back when I started as, conducting in 1978 after graduate school, some of the pieces that were, really important then don't even get played anymore because so much has changed and so much has happened in all in good ways. And if I just look at my 21 years at Michigan, the contributions of my colleagues at the University of Michigan to the wind band repertoire in that 20 plus years is astounding. I mean, we have either formally presented or have in the pipeline 109 commissions over that amount of time. And, it's going forward, and who knows where the end game will wind up. But, my predecessor, H. Robert Reynolds, figured out a way through using some funds to create the H. Robert Reynolds Band Commissioning Fund. And that was just really getting started when he retired and I took over. But those funds have been oxygen for a lot of creative ideas that I've been able to spawn with composers. And because consortiums, no one used to have consortiums. Consortiums started in my history in the mid-90s because a bunch of us college band conductors wanted to commission John Harbison. And there was a conference and there was a business meeting, and the person who was trying to organize it stood up and said, "Look, we don't have enough money. I need people to buy shares. Here's the buy-in." 10 minutes, it was done. Then, that sort of just took off. And I think the orchestra world has really been sort of chasing the band world in building consortiums. I mean, it used to be that you'd have Fancy Philharmonic would commission a piece and it would take, that person would get a lump sum and it'd get the one play. If it was good, then it would get a lot of play. And thank God for Kusevitsky in Boston. Think about all the things he did out of his foundation. And he did it singularly. He didn't have consortiums.
Yes.
But not many other orchestras had those consortiums. So now, we had a consortium with the Big Ten Band Directors Association and the New York Philharmonic to have a trumpet concerto written by Aaron J. Kernis. And, we've all, on both sides of the ensemble genre aisle, we've both been very collaborative in trying to work out things and also trying to work in ways in which our goals feed all sides of the aisle, not just one particular thing.
I have to have this conversation with you about the listener of the orchestral new music versus the listener of the wind ensemble or the band. Is it an elitist listener or form of music making because the instruments of the violin and the string, all the strings and piano, all this are so much more expensive, and that the children who don't have access to the funds for those instruments are given brass instruments, wind instruments, and percussion instruments? So with that in mind, do you think that the underprivileged sector of music student is going to gravitate towards the band and listening to all these fantastic new pieces Do you see an influence on the band world in poorer communities?
I don't know that I'm fully equipped to answer that, so I'm just going to take a stab at it, and I could be completely off base. I think that the band's dual history of concert performance, classical performance, with the more utilitarian track of community support through high school marching band and all that sort of stuff. I think it's as much that presence in a community that gives sway to wind instruments, in addition to what you said. And, if a community is going to invest in itself, the wind instruments who then show up at community events seemed like a more logical investment in some ways. So, there are lots of school districts across the country where they do not have an orchestra, but they have a band. They have a choir. Maybe they have a jazz band. But those are, I think, the reasons that you touched on about economics and the expense of instruments and all that sort of stuff all come into play. And I think the overriding thing for why they have a band when they don't have an orchestra in many smaller towns, less affluent areas, is because, to put it crudely, there's more bang for the investment of buck in terms of what the community gets. Now, I think there's lots of really terrific organizations that have sprung up over the last 20, 25 years to try to counteract this. And Crescendo Detroit is one. Yes. And that's at a public school level in Detroit, trying to do more of what the Sphinx organization does on a more national, international level. So I think so much of my response to your really deep philosophical and important question has to do with the specifics of the community, and not so much of a generalized statement. I know we're going to talk about Joel Puckett's piece, Shadow of Sirius, but I think one of the things that Joel has done that should be a model for a lot of young composers, if you look at a lot of his pieces, none of them sound the same.
Yes.
The flute piece, Shadow of Sirius, has one style. The piece Short Stories for String Quartet and Wind Ensemble. He wrote an opera. He wrote a trumpet concerto, which is different than anything else that he's written. He wrote an adagio symphony called Echoes of Time in the River. I mean, he's made a very purposeful attempt not to write the same thing. And there's a number of other composers that I think, do that with integrity and still have their own voice. But, it's interesting when you look at someone's career over a block of time. We can, with retrospect, look at Stravinsky and say Stravinsky had these periods. We can look at Copland and say Copland had these periods. Mozart didn't live long enough for him to do that. So there is a sense of evolution to each composer's development of voice. But I think the trap for them is becoming pegged by this is going to be another work like that. Some people find that very comforting because they know what they're getting. But over the arc of time, I think that's something that can be really dangerous for a composer.
That's true. I think of that often, and yet I just never thought of that. So you love a composer perhaps for their style, and then you say, okay, write me a piece, and yet you want something new. So do you really, or do you want something that's their style? So that's very interesting. You've been talking about tips to the composers themselves. Can you give some tips to the people who want to commission the work and to make it more fluid and easy? For instance, the first tip you gave was don't commission your friend a month in advance. Unless you're ready to give them a lot of Chinese food and beer. What are some of the other things you can expect? Maybe just leave them alone, or if they need you to play for them, like Michael Dougherty wanted me to play over a 2-year span, I would go over there. And what came out was so personal that I loved that kind of work. But some composers don't write that way. Some composers don't review. So help us out here to make any instrumentalist listening right now who wants to commission someone. How can we make it easier on all of everyone?
So I'm famous for using a term called eagle vision, which is that you have a clear idea of where this is going. And that's in opposition to chicken vision, which is the chicken is always pecking at the ground 2 feet in front of their face. And so if you avoid this first thing about, I got a recital in a couple of weeks, can you write me a piece? There you go. That's the first step toward not having chicken vision. But with eagle vision, if you just take the concepts of, why am I asking this person to write a piece? Am I asking this person to write a piece because I want to put it on social media and I want to look good? Am I asking this person to write a piece because I feel some obligation to diversify the repertoire? That's all good. But what's the real musical what is it you really want? Do you want a sonata? Do you want a piece with electronics? And finding out, if you don't know the person personally, they're not sitting 2 rows over. You've gone on their website and you think, oh, this would really be great. You have to communicate in such a way that you are sort of putting yourself at the mercy of the composer. And what I mean by that is, here's some ideas I have. Does anything resonate with you? And if nothing resonates, are you open to saying, is there something with my instrument or my proposal that you think might interest you if I give you some time to ruminate? And the composer might say, yeah, I'm just too busy, or give me a month, contact me again in a month, that sort of thing. Or they might say, yes, I'm interested, and my fee is $2,500 a minute.
Right.
Because most
or the New York Philharmonic just called, I have to put your concerto off for another year.
Yeah, I mean, those are all practical things, and that's why I think this notion of eagle visioning out. Now, when you're 18, 19, eagle vision is hard. Eagle vision is next Friday, so that's sometimes can be hard. But I think when you're in a collaborative environment like student environment, it's much easier to get by with a short-term composition, or the wonderful thing that Evan's done with composition students in studios, or that our colleague Courtney Snyder did last year in trying to create repertoire for chamber winds for an ensemble, which was to say, here's what's possible, who's interested. I mean, those kind of things can happen more in a school environment, and it's all very useful. But I think if you're crossing a bridge between, I'm no longer in school and what I want to do with this, I just think some of those things I just spoke about can be very helpful. Because if you get off on the wrong foot with a composer, it can be difficult. And if anybody wants to ask more questions about, tips, templates for contracts, whatever, feel free to email me at mlhaith@umich.edu, and I'd be happy to provide some additional information.
Oh, that's valuable. Thank you. Well, let's talk about this piece that can be played in community, which is called the Shadow of Sirius. The community is the band. The community is the flute professor or teacher playing with their colleague, the conductor, and the community is the students of that performer playing in the balcony antiphonally. So it's such a community-based piece. So congratulations on the commission of Shadow of Sirius 10 plus 1 years ago. So we're going to celebrate the 10 plus 1 anniversary. And thank you for this celebration. Has it been a success, this Joel Puckett work for flute band and antiphonal flute choir? Has it been a success because of the community or because of the consortium, or both?
I think, yeah, all those things work, but I think the real success of the piece is its tremendously heartfelt emotion by the composer that sings forth in this stunningly beautiful piece that is an atypical concerto. Um,
Well
you know,
said.
I
Yeah.
remember talking to Joel about the piece. We, in fact, were at Max and Irma's in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He was coming through town, and he and I had developed a friendship because I had premiered his dissertation piece, Ping Pang Pong, a few years earlier, and I had done several of his pieces and had done Ping Pang Pong at some all-state groups and that sort of thing. And he was, interested in a project, and we were sitting there talking about, having a hamburger, talking about, what might be. And I was looking for something to do with you. I wanted to do a flute piece. I had done a variety of concertos already with colleagues at Michigan over the first few years, but there wasn't really a flute piece that grabbed me. I'd done the Hank Bodding's flute concerto with my colleague at Baylor, and I had done the all-wind flute piece with 8 winds. That's a very nice piece, but I didn't feel like there was really a great representation in the flute concerto with the wind medium. There were several transcriptions, the Carmen Fantasies and all that, but I wasn't really interested in that. So we're sitting there talking, and he was, was like, well, I don't know that I can write a typical concerto that will have anything new to say. So I said to him, it doesn't have to be a technically difficult concerto. It could be a concerto based on feeling and emotion and all the things that the flute brings to the table that other instruments don't necessarily, and use the resources that is the artistry of Amy Porter. So we left that conversation agreeing to build a concerto. And I really had no idea that it would turn into what it turned into. But Joel and his wife suffered a tragic loss of a yet to be born baby. And that tragedy turned him toward the poetry that is Shadow of Sirius. And all those links came together in this stunningly beautiful piece. And it's simple in ways that are profound, yet it's emotionally rich in ways that are equally profound. And the flute part is not typical technical virtuosity like the classical canonic form of a concerto, but yet it's not every flute player can play it. So I think he knocked it out of the park. And I think all those things together make the casserole of success that this piece has had. I mean, it's been recorded at least a dozen times, and it gets played quite a bit. So I'm excited to go back to it. I mean, we've had a couple of rehearsals already for performance on October 22nd, and I love it all the more. The only thing I regret is that 10 plus 1 years later, the notes look much smaller than they did 10 years ago.
And for the listeners who want to hear Joel Puckett talk about this piece, you need look no further than season 1 of Porter Flute Pod, episode 5. And when we had our friend cast number 1, it was Joel Puckett. So you can find out the genesis.
There's also an interview he did about the piece on what used to be called iTunes, Apple Music. It was part of the Artifacts CD that the Symphony Band recorded in 2011. And there's quite a good explanation by Joel, as well as, I must say, a recording that I'm immensely proud of by the University of Michigan Symphony Band, but really honored to have shared with the artist that is Amy Porter. It's quite an experience.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. It was a great experience, and I'm looking forward to doing it again. Although this time I will have a different flute maker in my hands. And so it's a new experience for the entire body. And so please join us in Hill Auditorium on October 22nd. That's a Friday. And the downbeat is always right at 8 o'clock. Michael, I just, as an addendum, want to thank you for your professionalism in rehearsals. Your band really appreciates that. Is there something you can advise everyone about in being a great colleague and a musician and a leader like you are about scheduling and not wasting people's time, and especially in rehearsing for a commission like this? How important is that, all those things? That you're just so great at the scheduling. Help us out.
Well, I think, and I say this to students all the time, the people you work with have two tremendous resources: their talent and their time. And if you waste either, you're not doing your job. And so when I program, when I schedule, when I communicate, when I correct, when I advise, when I instruct, lead in rehearsal, that's constantly going through my mind. How can I be the most prepared? How can I be the most efficient? How can I be the most effective? There's all this talk about conductors being dictators and ensembles not being a democracy. Well, you can't take a vote on how you're going to have a phrase. That's not professional. We're trying to build professionals. And so, but what I can do is create an atmosphere in the room that is always positive, always collaborative, within the reasons that we do what we do. And I want every student to come into the room feeling safe, to learn and to grow. And if they make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. We can try again. But there has to be that atmosphere that, if you make a mistake of effort, fine. But if you make a mistake because you're not prepared, then it's not about, you're not necessarily hurting me, but you're hurting everybody else, because we're going to have to spend time. And I think, one of the things that I've been really so appreciative of the students at my time at Michigan, and the same was true at Baylor, where I spent 23 years before coming to Michigan, is that sort of respect, the atmosphere of respect, it feeds itself. So they respect each other. They respect the music. They respect what we're doing. I don't have to be nasty or be mean or crack a whip or anything. And isn't that what education and art should be about. So I don't know. To me, it's just sort of a simple truth. And I suppose I can attribute my feelings to my upbringing and to my musical mentors and to the colleagues I've worked with over the years. I just don't know any other way.
You know everyone's name. You say hello to them in the hallway. You seem to care about them personally. So I just want to thank you for being the mentor of so many hundreds of young musicians out there.
Well, over 44 years, the Rolodex is pretty deep.
Of course it is.
But nothing gives me greater pleasure than to hear from former students who have success or who need something. And if I can't know somebody's name, how can I ask them to work hard?
Exactly.
So, knowing their name, knowing where they're from, knowing what their goals are, to me, that's just part of being a teacher. I hate the term maestro because I don't feel like a maestro, but the root word of maestro is teacher, not pontificate.
That's
so,
right.
I am who I am.
And we love that. Thank you so much, Michael Haithcock.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Michael Haithcock, for being that person we know we can go to when we have questions. And thank you for bringing us your insights and wisdom on Porter Flute Pod. You can reach Michael, MLHAITH, at umich.edu. And he gave you that email address earlier in the podcast. And thank you, Joel Puckett, for going deep within and creating our flute concerto, The Shadow of Sirius. I'll be performing The Shadow of Sirius on Friday, October 22nd at 8 o'clock p.m. in Hill Auditorium in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with the University of Michigan Symphony Band. And the flute section are members of my flute studio. Speaking of my studio, you're welcome to join us in Porter Flute Pod next episode for our Go Blue Flutes theme, and you'll meet the freshmen, the class of 2025. You can find more about me at amyporter.com or for students, porterflute.com. Thanks for being here. I'm so grateful for you.